look at me as a clear target. Yeah. Because I was surrounded.
This land is composed of two different cultures, a white culture and a colored culture, and I've lived close to them all my life. But I'm told now that we've mistreated them and that we must change, and these changes are coming faster than I expected. And I'm required to make decisions on a basis of a new way of thinking, and it's difficult. It's difficult for me, it's difficult for all Southerners.
All the people of the South are in favor of segregation. And Supreme Court or no Supreme Court, we are going to maintain...
We never have any trouble until some of our Southern niggers go up north and the NAACP talks to them and they come back home.
This moral issue. A moral issue comes from your heart in the first place. If I thought it was sinful and irreligious and immoral to separate myself socially and educationally from Negro citizens, then I would commit a sin when I did so, I suppose. But I believe that separation is good for the Negro citizen and the white citizen.
In their best interest.
And in their best interest. And if I do something that my heart tells me is good for both groups, there's not anything that runs counter to any religion or any law of morality. It's not sinful.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
They want to throw white children and colored children into the melting pot of integration, out of which will come a conglomerated, mulatto, mongrel class of people. Both races will be destroyed in such a movement.
There will be no enforced integration in Virginia.
Desegregation is against the Bible. I find my scripture for this in Genesis 9:27.
I've seen it happen myself. Here in Alabama, no Negro is ever embarrassed. He knows the cafes he goes to. He knows the ones that the whites go to.
If we're wrong, why don't you arrest us?
Why don't you get out in front of the camera and go on?
It's not a matter of being in front of the camera. It's a matter of facing your sheriff and facing your judge. We're willing to be beaten for democracy, and you misuse democracy in the street. You beat people bloody in order that they will not have the privilege to vote. You beat me in the side and then hide your blows. I don't need to leave. We've come to register to vote.
90% of the white people in Alabama are for segregation, but in the last few years we have had quite a number of backsliders, you might say, that for political reasons, to further their political ambitions, have been trying to garner the Negro vote and would do most anything to get that vote. The Citizens Council is out to utterly destroy those people.
The so-called Negro movement is a part of the attempted takeover of our country by the lazy, the indolent, the beatniks, the ignorant, and by some misguided religionists and bleeding hearts, and all being led by the politicians who stay in office by appealing, remember, not to reason, but to the most votes.
I spoke for the white people. The white people rallied behind it, and we kicked the living hell out of the niggers, sent the out-of-town niggers to the hospital and out of the state, put back to their own hometowns where they ought to have been, and the niggers in St. Augustine got quiet and went back over to Nigger Town where they belong.
It's just not things we're used to down here. I mean, they come in and they sit down, and we're not used to them sitting down beside us, because I wasn't raised with them. I never have lived with them, and I'm not going to start now.
But believe me, there were those that followed Hitler, like you blindly follow this Sheriff Clark, who didn't think their day would come. But they also were pulled into the courtrooms, and they were also given their death sentences. You're not this bad a racist, but you're racist in the same way that Hitler was a racist. and you're blindly following a man that's leading you down a road that's going to bring you...
Can we honestly say that it doesn't affect our security and the fight for peace when Negroes and others are denied their full constitutional rights? When we in this country...
Our city and our county has been subjected to the greatest pressures I think any community in the country has had to withstand. We've had in our area here outside agitation groups of all levels. We've had Martin Luther King. We have had...
You take Martin Luther King, that is being led by communists all over this great country, feels that he has the key to the White House. He has the telephone call to the White House that can get anything he wants.
Well, I've just gotten through a couple of weeks ago with a 45 or 46-day battle of Ingram Park, I call it. That's the park there in Birmingham where we stopped Martin Luther King. And I mean, ladies and gentlemen, we had that nigger whipped.
You've had some rather personal and trying experiences yourself. Are you afraid?
No, I'm not. My attitude is that this is a great cause, it is a great issue that we are confronted with, and that the consequences for my personal life are not particularly important.
The black man got a champion. They call him Martin Luther King. We call him Lucifer. And if this nigger thinks he can scare the niggers out, I'll also inform him that the white men can be stirred up to defend what is rightfully theirs.
America for white, Africa for black. Send those apes back to the tree, ship those niggers back. Ring that bell, shout for joy, white man's day is here. No more niggers, civil rights led by nigger queer. America for white, Africa for black. Send those apes back to the tree, ship those niggers back. Ship those niggers back. Ship those niggers back. Ship those niggers back.
I don't think we can give anybody any guarantees. Say that we've reached a point where we almost are where the Jews are when Hitler took power. That are you going to sit by and wait until you're put in a concentration camp, or you're going to organize and fight?
He said, now y'all think they're going to get me, but all y'all going to be out there jumping in front of the camera and said, the bullet might be aimed for me, but one of y'all are going to get it. He said, but don't worry. He said, I will preach the best funeral you ever had. And then he'd start preaching your funeral. Andy Young was a fine young man.
I'm tired of living every day under the threat of death. I have no martyr complex. I want to live as long as anybody in this building tonight. And sometimes I begin to doubt whether I'm going to make it through. I must confess I'm tired.
By 1963, November 22nd, 1963, Dr. King had his life threatened many times. In Montgomery, they bombed his home. He came up to New York to autograph a book that documented the Montgomery movement. Had been stabbed in the chest. So death was not a stranger to him. The thought of his own death was one that often came because people were threatening all the time. But I think when the president went down, I think all of us had a little lump in our throats because we knew that if they take out a president, that he can take out Martin.
What did he say to you when he came up to you, sir?
Well, he said, I want to see you. I told him earlier at the courthouse that he could speak at our meeting tonight if he wanted to, and I invited him and told him that he could have 15 minutes. So I asked him if he was planning to come, and he said, I want to see you about that. Can I step over? And I said, yes. And he came over and started hitting me.
Where did you hit him again?
Right here.
Right forward.
And then after they pulled him away, he started kicking me.
Are you injured in any way? Do you feel any...
I don't think so. I just feel a slight headache, and I'm sure that'll pass away shortly.
Will you press charges against this man?
No, I don't plan to.
John F. Kennedy died. We were sitting together, and he said, that's exactly what's going to happen to me.
God has told me that he wants freedom for his people. And I'm not going to run from the responsibility. It may even mean physical death, but if it means that I will die standing up for the freedom of my people, God has spoken to me.
They were there to really assassinate me, but that they could never get me as a clear target because I was surrounded. But that wasn't the scariest moment. Philadelphia, Mississippi, and Chicago on the day that we marched through that narrow street. And we marched about 4,000 or 5,000 people that day, but they were in trees.
Johnson wanted to befriend the movement, but King was difficult for him. Martin was not an inside Washington guy. You know, Johnson loved to deal with people. He was a checkers player. He moved these people around. He couldn't move Martin around that way. And then there was Hoover, always sitting on Johnson's ear, spilling poison in it about Martin.
J. Edgar Hoover was the original director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. J. Edgar Hoover was more popular than most presidents.
Dr. King was threatening to the America that Mr. Hoover believed in and saw and wanted.
Hoover, I think, had a pathological hatred of black people. And he just couldn't stand Martin.
And his biggest tool was the communist bugaboo. As a matter of fact, he persuaded Bobby Kennedy that he just had to have the right to tap Dr. King, tap his phones, and put him on under excruciating surveillance.
When we heard that Martin won the Nobel Peace Prize, he was in St. Joseph's Hospital, downtown Atlanta. I went down there immediately, and he was saying when Coretta had called him and told him about it, he thought he was dreaming.
A month later, J. Edgar Hoover comes out of nowhere saying that Dr. King is the most notorious liar in the country. That made the front pages, and that phrase came out, but it was a long diatribe on what a nasty person, and if I could only tell you how nasty he is.
Dr. King believed deeply in what he was about, what the movement was about. So for someone to say he was the most notorious liar was simply deeply hurtful. And I know that he was wounded by that.
When I called Dr. King in Atlanta and tried to set up a meeting between the two men, he did not respond to my calls. He waited 3, 4, 5 days, and finally I got a call from Andrew Young.
It was Andy, myself, Dr. King with us as well. We went to the FBI office. It turned out to be a rather amusing meeting because we had come to have him explain to us why he would go public and say that Dr. King was the most notorious liar in the country. And he never addressed the question. He just took us through a little lecture on what the FBI is trying to do and how they're trying to protect the rights of all citizens. Yeah.
You know, he had these black guys in his office whom he called agents. One of them agented him out of his coat every day and then would agent him back into his coat every day. One guy drove him around. Hoover believed that this black population, uneducated, poor, downtrodden, was particularly susceptible to manipulation by communists. And in a sense, he was right. There were communists in the civil rights movement who played an extremely helpful role. They weren't always the people he thought they were, and they didn't always do the things he thought they did. He was wrong to suspect that these people somehow were hostile to the best interest of the United States.
From Washington, D.C., Reverend Martin Luther King, Jr., president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference,
will face the nation.
Dr. King, it's been alleged that you have been slow to sever your ties with alleged communists in the civil rights movement, even after government officials have warned you against them.
First, I'd like to say that communism is based on an ethical relativism, a metaphysical materialism, a denial of human freedom, and a crippling totalitarianism that I could never accept. The only person that they identified that had any connection with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was removed. He's been off of our staff a long, long time.
Well, this places you in the direct opposite position of the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, J. Edgar Hoover, who gave some testimony recently to the contrary.
I would hope that the FBI would come out and say something that I think is much more significant, and that is that it is amazing that so few Negroes have turned to communism in the light of that desperate plight. I think it is one of the amazing developments of the 20th century, how loyal the Negro has remained to America in spite of his long night of oppression and discrimination.
FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover put it in perspective when he said, in his testimony before the House Appropriations Committee in 1962,
"Since its inception, the Communist Party, USA, has been alert on every possible issue or event which could be used to exploit the American Negro in furtherance of party aims."
We most certainly do not and will not give protection to civil rights workers. In the first place, the FBI is not a police organization. It's purely an investigative organization, and the protection of individual citizens, either natives of the state or coming into the state, is a matter for the local authorities. The FBI will not participate in any such protection.
But the FBI can make arrests, on-the-spot arrests. They do it in many other cases where you have narcotics, auto thefts, bank robberies. It's only when you come to civil rights that there is this tendency to be rather slow. But I'm not...
Hoover was shocked that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. would dare to criticize the Bureau. He ordered his agents to bug King's motel rooms, where they recorded alleged extramarital affairs.
He actually played those tapes for reporters. Hoover was obsessed with King. He wanted to bring King down as a leader. Why that was, I think, was because he criticized the Bureau. The fact that Dr. King was black and criticized the Bureau probably made it that much worse.
When King was chosen for the Nobel Peace Prize in October 1964, it was almost more than Edgar could stand. A dogmatic Hoover protege named William Sullivan, head of domestic intelligence, went so far as to send copies of the surveillance tapes to King's home in Atlanta. Included inside was an anonymous threat. The letter ended with a sinister suggestion saying, quote, "There is but one way out for you. You better take it before your filthy, abnormal, fraudulent self is bared to the nation."
Did you know right away that it was from the FBI?
Sure. It really was tragic that anybody in official circles would sink to such depths.
Well, I listened to the tape and I didn't find anything on there that, you know, that appeared to be anything like that.
Today, Coretta Scott King is speaking for the first time about the sexual allegations the FBI was using to try and destroy her husband.
I feel so strongly because Martin and I never had one argument about a woman. Not one.
What is the truth?
As far as I'm concerned, I don't know of any relationship that my husband had. Not saying that there weren't some, because nobody's a saint, but I don't know of any. Martin was not a promiscuous man. He was not that kind of a man.
Martin Luther King was the kind of man who managed to keep his family sealed away from the dangers he faced.
We felt so safe and so protected and very secure.
He expected that he would be killed. He thought that ultimately it was going to be because of his opposition to the war in Vietnam, and perhaps more importantly because of his tremendous commitment to bring economic justice to this republic. Because when he entered that fray, When he began to talk about the redistribution of wealth, you have to understand he was coming up against the most powerful forces in this land.
We have stood up for nonviolence with all of our hearts, and those who will make this peaceful revolution impossible will make a violent revolution inevitable. And it didn't cost the nation 1 penny to integrate lunch counters. Well, it didn't cost the nation 1 penny to guarantee the right to vote. But now we are dealing with issues that cannot be solved without the nation spending billions of dollars and undergoing a radical redistribution of economic power.
Bill Moyers, when he was a leading White House aide in the LBJ administration, was one of the individuals that circulated a monograph which was full of red-baiting material about Martin Luther King that turns out now to be totally scurrilous, suggesting that this great intellectual was a dupe of Moscow and that this white former communist sympathizer was leading him around by the nose. I mean, it's vicious racism.
Civil rights leader Martin Luther King leads the procession to the United Nations, where he urges UN pressure to force the U.S. to stop bombing North Vietnam.
Johnson was bitterly disappointed with King's opposition to the war. And he was being told by Hoover that King had lots of pro-communist friends who were advising him.
The FBI worked to discredit King and continued its surveillance of him and his associates.
We knew that everything we were doing during this period was being monitored. We weren't always sure who.
We talked about that constantly, so that there were times when we spoke to one another from safe phones, given what the nature of the information was and where we would be. Find a safe phone, give me the number, I'll go to a safe phone and call you.
With his opposition now public, contributions to King's organization, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, dropped sharply.
The promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam, making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home.
You know, wasn't the thing he had to do? I think it was not a political thing, because as it turned out, I think it was kind of like a death knell for him. But it was a very brave thing for him to do, because he went against all the people, you know, who we considered reasonable.
Others can do what they want to do. That's their business. Other civil rights leaders, for various reasons, refuse or can't take a stand or have to go along with the administration. That's their business. But I must say tonight that I know that justice is indivisible. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The world now demands a maturity of America that we may not be able to achieve. It demands that we admit that we have been wrong from the beginning of our adventure in Vietnam, that we have been detrimental to the life of the Vietnamese people. The situation is one in which we must be ready to turn sharply from our present ways. The New Testament says, repent. It is time for America to repent now, for the kingdom of God is at hand. As we counsel young men concerning military service, we must clarify for them our nation's role in Vietnam and challenge them with the alternative of conscientious objections. And I say this morning that it is my hope that every young man in this country who finds this war objectionable and abominable and unjust, but file as a conscientious objector. Now let me tell you the truth about it. They must see Americans as strange liberators. You realize that the Vietnamese people proclaimed their own independence in 1945 after a combined French and Japanese occupation. And incidentally, this was before the Communist Revolution in China. They were led by Ho Chi Minh. This is a little-known fact. These people declared themselves independent in 1945. They quoted our Declaration of Independence in their document of freedom. Yet our government refused to recognize. President Truman said they were not ready for independence. So we fell victim as a nation at that time of the same deadly arrogance that has poisoned the international situation for all of these years. France then set out to reconquer its former colony. They fought 8 long, hard, brutal years trying to reconquer Vietnam. You know who helped France? It was the United States of America. Came to the point that we were meeting more than 80% of the war costs. And even when France started despairing of its reckless action, we did not. In 1954, a conference was called at Geneva, and an agreement was reached. Because France had been defeated at Dien Bien Phu. Even after that, and even after the Geneva Accord, we did not stop. We must face the sad fact that our government sought in a real sense to sabotage the Geneva Accord. Well, after the French were defeated, it looked as if independence and land reform would come through the Geneva Agreement. But instead, the United States came and started supporting a man named D.M., who turned out to be one of the most ruthless dictators in the history of the world. He set out to silence all opposition. People were brutally murdered merely because they raised their voices against the brutal policies of D.M. Peasants watched and cringed as D.M. ruthlessly rooted out all opposition. The peasants watched as all this was presided over by United States influence, and then by increasing numbers of United States troops who came to help quell the insurgency that D.M.'s methods had aroused. When D.M. was overthrown, they may have been happy. The long line of military dictatorship seemed to offer no real change, especially in terms of their need for land and peace. And who are we supporting in Vietnam today? It's a man by the name of General Key, who fought with the French against his own people, and who said on one occasion that the greatest hero of his life is Hitler. This is who we are supporting in Vietnam today. Oh, our government and the press generally won't tell us these things, but God told me to tell you this morning. The truth must be told. The only change came from America as we increased our true commitments in support of governments which were singularly corrupt, inept, and without popular support. And all the while the people read our leaflets and received regular promises of peace and democracy and land reform. Now they languish under our bombs and consider us, not their fellow Vietnamese, the real enemy. They move sadly and apathetically as we herd them off the land of their fathers into concentration camps where minimal social needs are rarely met. They know they must move or be destroyed by our bombs. So they go, primarily women and children and the aged. They watch as we poison their water, as we kill 1 million acres of their crops. They must weep as the bulldozers roar through their areas preparing to destroy the precious trees. They wander into the towns and see thousands of the children homeless without clothes, running in packs on the streets like animals. They see the children degraded by our soldiers as they beg for food. They see the children selling their sisters to our soldiers, soliciting for their mothers. We have destroyed their two most cherished institutions, the family and the village. We have destroyed their land and their crops. We have cooperated in the crushing of the nation's only non-communist revolutionary political force, the United Buddhist Church. This is a role our nation has taken, the role of those who make peaceful revolutions impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that comes from the immense profits of overseas investments. I'm convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society, when machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people. The giant triplets of racism, militarism, and economic exploitation are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our present policies. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth with righteous indignation. It will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West invest in huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries, and say this is not just. It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of Latin America and say this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others, nothing to learn from them, is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hands on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. Sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you're too arrogant. If you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
and I'll place it in the hands of a nation that doesn't even know my name.
I think the moral force of Dr. King's opposition had to be an enormous body blow to the president. That's when I first observed him not meeting with Dr. King. And I don't think Dr. King came into the White House many times after that.
He went from being someone whom Lyndon Johnson had brought to the White House on his way back from winning the Nobel Prize to someone, once he gave his speech attacking the war in '67, and you'll have to pardon the language, Johnson referred to as a nigger preacher.
I want to make it very clear that I'm going to continue with all of my might, with all of my energy, and with all of my action to oppose that abominable, evil, unjust war in Vietnam.
King begins to see that what was happening in Vietnam was also connected with poverty and connected with racism and classism. And that's when he begins to think about another march. And this march is going to be a march to transform the economic situation of people in this country.
Some propose marching the poor to the nation's capital to force government action on the problems of poverty. In August, Marion Wright took the idea of a Poor People's March on Washington to her friend, Martin King.
He immediately understood that it was right, and we chatted a bit about how it would be done, but there was never any discussion about whether that was the right thing to do.
The Poor People's Campaign would recruit among all races, bring them to Washington, commit massive civil disobedience, force the government to respond, a nonviolent army of the poor.
Very frankly, this is a search for an alternative to riots. And if the nation doesn't respond to us, as we labor that 2 or 3 months, however long it takes, God only knows what we will face in terms of chaos. This is a kind of last desperate demand for the nation to respond to nonviolence.
One has to remember that over 100 cities burned in America in 1967. It was the worst rioting in the history of the country had taken place. And the rioting was the result of poverty, growing poverty, deprivation of people, and Martin King committing himself to bring 500,000 people to Washington, not just on a march, but for an encampment, to stay there until the Congress changed its priorities, was a devastating potential for those who resided in the halls of power in America. They thought the nation would burn. They thought the capital would be subject to a mighty revolution. Martin King was at the center of all of this. He was the key figure of dissent and opposition leadership in America.
They were really and truly afraid of us coming to Washington. And they were determined to try to stop us.
Martin King, as you know, came out and gave a speech called Why I'm Opposed to Vietnam. And in that speech, he talked about God's judgment on America. He talked about America being arrogant. This is King, who we love so much and revere and have the holiday and cast as a dreamer. He talked about an arrogant America. He talked about God's judgment on America. And he said these words at the time, that the U.S. is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. The minute he said that, he fell off the list of the most admired Americans. In 1967, they disinvited him to the White House. Here's a guy who in 64 and 65 helped Lyndon Johnson sign the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Act. In 67, a couple years later, they disinvite him from the White House. In 68, they shoot him dead. Part of being a patriot means to stand as a truth teller and say what's got to be said. What's wrong right there?
But just so you don't get into trouble, the they that disinvited him from the White House is a little different than the they who shot him dead.
I can debate you. I can debate you.
Really?
I can debate you.
It's an evil war. No matter where it leads, no matter what abuses it may bring, I'm going to tell the truth. We've burned down too many rice fields. We've run too many peasants and humble people out of their villages and out of their little huts. It's time, America, to come on home from Vietnam.
It scared the Army that a man had that much strength in the United States could influence a war that they were losing.
In 1993, then reporter Steve Tompkins wrote a series of articles for the Memphis Commercial Appeal, claiming that Army intelligence officers were certain King was leading a revolution.
And they felt that if Dr. King was turning against the war, and Dr. King was saying, I'm going to shut down the government to stop this war, Dr. King then was becoming an enemy.
And when King announced plans to lead hundreds of thousands in a Poor People's March on Washington, James Earl Ray's attorney William Pepper says government leaders became even more alarmed.
And when they viewed the Pentagon demonstration in October of '67, they got what they thought was a taste of barbarians at the gate.
William Pepper's controversial theory, now embraced by the King family, is that the government's fear of Dr. King was behind the plot to kill him.
And so he was never going to be allowed to bring that mass of humanity to Washington. That, I believe, was the primary reason why he was killed.
Pepper bases much of his theory on Stephen Tompkins' unnamed Army sources, who he claims followed King's every move.
They told me that the Army would never have let Dr. King get to Washington. And they said, well, let's just say we would have stopped him somehow.
Tompkins says the Army was terrified there might be more of the rioting that had swept America's inner cities the previous summer. Newark, New Jersey. 23 people killed in sniper fire. Detroit. Week-long rioting, the worst this century. 43 dead.
They'd seen what happened in Detroit. They saw what happened in Newark. We've got black Americans shooting at our soldiers. Something is terribly wrong here, and the United States is in danger.
But you see, the real problem with violence is that we have never been violent. We have been too nonviolent.
And the government worried that King could no longer control the young black militants also planning to come to Washington.
There is no reason for us to believe that the same destructive rioting and violence cannot, or that it will not, happen here in Washington. If King attempts his so-called Poor People's March.
It's one thing to bring in a group of political demonstrators who've worked together and who've had training in civil disobedience. It's another to assemble a lot of poor folks from the ghettos of America and the slums of America, assisted by street gangs from Chicago for security, and bring them into the nation's capital.
And as we know now, they were saying that we must never allow another leader such as Dr. King to rise in black America. So there were great forces. But we were really at a turning point in America then.
On the day of his death, King and his aides gathered at the Lorraine Motel. Dozens of Memphis police officers patrolled the surrounding streets. And as they had for years, FBI agents had Dr. King under tight surveillance. But at the motel that morning, the civil rights leaders seemed at ease.
I see Dr. King come from the restaurant, which was down a little alley.
Former New York Times reporter Earl Caldwell was also staying at the motel.
And he walks up onto the balcony and crosses the balcony, goes to his room. By himself. He didn't have a security with him, nobody. If anybody wanted to do him harm, he was right there.
That same day, a man using an alias checked into a small rooming house directly across from the motel. The common bathroom near his room had a clear view of King's balcony. That man was James Earl Ray, at the time an escaped convict who had been serving time for robbing a grocery store, and who, records prove, bought a rifle fitted with a sniper scope just 6 days before.
I heard a rifle shot, and I ran to the door.
Reporter Earl Caldwell's room was underneath and to one side of Dr. King's.
And I was very embarrassed to find that it wasn't a rifle shot. was a Coca-Cola bottle that the housekeeper had dropped off her tray, and it had broken on the concrete walkway outside my door.
It was one of those cool spring evenings.
Just arrived to pick up Dr. King for dinner, Billy Kiles.
He asked me to pick out a tie, a couple ties. I said, this one's better. It was black and orange or something.
6 p.m. Down by the car, Andrew Young, Jesse Jackson, an aide named James Orange, and Dr. King's driver were waiting.
James Orange and I were behind the limousine, shadowboxing, and sort of clowning, and just having a good time and feeling good.
I said, guys, let's go. I got 5 or 6 steps.
Last words, do I really need a coat? And then the shot rang out.
Pow-yow.
This explosion, which I took to be a bomb, I thought, Jesus, someone's bombed a motel.
I looked back, and Martin was lying on the balcony. I think one of his shoes had come off. His foot was on the railing. There was a crushed cigarette in his hand.
His pulse was still, you know, you could still feel his pulse, and he was still breathing.
The tie that I had picked out had been severed, and the knot was upside down. There was a gaping hole in his face. And all this seems impossible. It just didn't seem, I mean, it was a dream.
An ambulance rushed Dr. King to St. Joseph's Hospital. Just outside, King's aide, Jesse Jackson.
All I know is that police were all around. You had literally 100 to 150 police in the area. And they didn't see anybody.
I was in my bedroom and the phone rang. And the first call I got was from Jesse Jackson. He says, Dr. King was shot.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, 39.
I came in the room and she had turned on the television set and I heard the announcement. And I remember I went in my room and I prayed and I said, please don't let my daddy die.
A sniper's bullet cut down Dr. King as he...
Very shortly, Andy Young called. He either said he's not dead or he's still living. Well, I knew then when he said it like that.
We're going to go to Memphis now.
Martin Luther King Jr. was pronounced dead at 11 minutes past 7 o'clock.
Police came in and conducted a very quick investigation. And
that night, ABC News reporter Tom Jarrell was in Memphis.
The shot apparently came from an apartment building directly across the street.
From the police and from witnesses near the rooming house, a theory of what had happened was already getting out.
The police here in Memphis immediately issued a bulletin for a young white man dressed in dark clothes who dashed out of that building across the street. He dropped a rifle, which was fitted with a scope, on the sidewalk, and then he fled.
The official story about a lone assassin quickly emerged, and as Memphis police swarmed the crime scene that night, the FBI launched the largest manhunt in Bureau history. But some claim the investigation was far from thorough.
I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you.
Less than 24 hours after he spoke those words, Martin Luther King was assassinated. His accused killer, James Earl Ray, pled guilty to the murder, and the case was officially closed. However, just 3 days after his conviction, Ray recanted his guilty plea, alleging that he was but a pawn in a wide-ranging conspiracy to kill King. But Ray's claims of innocence were dismissed, and the case remained closed. In 1976, 8 years after King's death, a select committee of the U.S. House of Representatives was impaneled to reinvestigate the assassinations of King and President John F. Kennedy. The committee concluded that James Earl Ray was the lone assassin of Dr. King. It is a conclusion, however, that Walter Fauntleroy, the chairman of the King subcommittee, now believes was wrong.
When you look at a murder, you look at 3 things. Who had the motive, the means, and the opportunity. I'm not now satisfied that James Earl Ray had a sufficient motive, that he had the means, and certainly the opportunity to pull it off as it was done.
Oh, I thought it was over. I thought that they had gotten the right man, and that it was a closed book. It was all over. I turned my back on political activity at that point in time, and I really was thoroughly disillusioned, but I thought that the case was solved.
9 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Bill Pepper began a career in law. One day, he took a phone call that would change his life. It was from one of King's closest friends, who said he was worried about James Earl Ray's conviction. He asked Pepper to visit Ray in prison.
When Ralph Abernathy asked me to go and meet with Ray, I didn't really want to do this, and what makes you think, you know, that anything can be gained from such an interview? And I said, besides, I don't know enough to ask James Earl Ray anything. It's going to take me quite a while to read and hone up on this. And do you really think it's worth it? And he said, well, I want to do it. I'd like to do it, and I'd like you to interrogate him in my presence.
Ray was being held in a high-security jail in Tennessee. The two men talked for 5 hours. By the end of the visit, Pepper's view of the assassination had changed completely.
James threw about 200 oral questions and follow-ups to those, and he was under stress part of the time, because there was no break, really. As a result of that intensive questioning, focusing on details of the actual assassination, both Reverend Abernathy and I came away with the view that he was not guilty of the killing. We didn't know what other role he might have played, but in terms of the shooting, we had no question that he was not the assassin. The story was plausible, and he was consistent, and I went back over it again and again in various details with him, and I found him credible. But beyond that, he had no knowledge of weapons whatsoever. When I went into the streets of Memphis and Shelby County and began to talk to people and began to look at evidence and began to consider issues with people who were there and on the scene, the inconsistencies that I found, the unanswered questions that I found, the unaccepted evidence that came forward, evidence that had been rejected that came forward, had a cumulative effect on me. And I knew, increasingly knew, that we were staring injustice in the face.
Your position is that you are completely innocent?
Yes. I don't have no responsibility for it. I did commit certain, they probably considered criminal offenses, but they were nothing serious. I probably wouldn't got over 5 or 10 years for them, aggregated.
Would you say that those criminal offenses were related to the case?
No, most of them are related. See, I escaped from Missouri prison in July 1967 and went to Canada. Most of them are related to that, false driver's license and fictitious names and all that type of thing, and there's nothing really serious.
And one witness has surfaced who says he knows Ray did not pull the trigger. Lloyd Jowers, who was there that day, told ABC's Sam Donaldson he knows something about that contract killer, allegedly in the bushes.
Did James Earl Ray kill Dr. Martin Luther King?
No, sir, he did not.
Do you know who killed Dr. King?
I know who was paid to do it.
Jowers says he will tell more, only if granted immunity from prosecution. So far, the Memphis District Attorney has taken no action. Former United Nations Ambassador Andrew Young, one of Dr. King's closest aides.
James Earl Ray, in your heart of hearts at this moment, you think he is innocent?
Yeah, I do.
And
they say they want the justice Dr. King never received, and they want to know who really killed him. Of one thing they are certain, it was not the man convicted of the assassination.
Everybody is united in the belief that James Earl Ray not only did not pull the trigger, he didn't know there was going to be a murder that day. Everybody.
Absolutely.
Evidence I've seen and heard will vindicate or exonerate James Earl Ray, and also it will point the finger at who actually was behind the assassination.
This man has sat there 29 years, and he had almost basically nothing to do with this assassination.
I think truth.
So then, who does the King family blame for Dr. King's death?
I am told that it was part and parcel Army intelligence, CIA, FBI.
This is a staggering idea to carry around.
Yes.
I think we knew it all along. That's why we're not like jumping out of our seats, because we've known for years.
What's more, Dexter King now believes the plot went all the way to the White House.
Do you believe that Lyndon Johnson was part of the plot to kill your father?
I do.
Colonel Fletcher Prouty was head of special operations in the Pentagon in the 1960s.
I certainly knew of plans that were intended to bring about an assassination. For example, in the case of Castro. So they created an organization called Mongoose. Mongoose was the cover word for it. Now, the objective of the Mongoose program was to assassinate Castro by any means. We even used mafia hitmen, skilled mechanics, skilled killers. Now, there's no reason to believe that Mongoose ended when somebody decided that, well, we're not going to kill Castro this year, we'll let it go. But Mongoose is an assassination incorporated organization.
From your experience in government, Fletcher, do you think it conceivable that a secret intelligence unit could have planned and carried out the assassination of Martin Luther King?
You needn't have to include the word intelligence unit. It's just a secret unit. And there's no question about it being a unit. Anybody that thinks today that either Kennedy assassination, either one of them, or the King assassination, and others that we might go into, were done by individuals, just doesn't understand the business at all. The easiest way to see that the program is laid on in a team effort, carefully planned and carried out, begins after the murder, as how to get them out of there and how to cover the thing so people don't realize that a team of gunmen did the job. Martin Luther King was registered on the first floor. Somebody went there ahead of time and told the landlady of the motel that he didn't want to be on the first floor, he wanted to be on the second floor. Nobody in King's party had made that contact. You see, that's the advanced planning. Then afterwards, all the things that happened, the chase of Ray halfway around the world and all the other things that came up, are a cover plan which is so complete that even to this day, no one has broken the system completely, and you can't get it into the courts anyway.
Links between the police and the FBI were unusually strong in Memphis. Not only was Fire and Police Chief Holloman running the Memphis FBI in the early 60s, but he also worked for 7 years in charge of the office of FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover.
The Communist Party of the United States is a fifth column, if there ever was one. It is far better organized than were the Nazis in occupied countries prior to their capitulation. They are seeking to weaken America, just as they did in their era of obstruction when they were aligned with the Nazis. Their goal is the overthrow of our government.
During the course of our investigation, we revealed the fact that the mission of the FBI was to destroy Dr. King.
It certainly was immoral, illegal, and unethical for the Bureau to use its power to try to destroy Dr. King, and particularly to do so by falsifying information. And they did falsify it over and over and over again.
And he should know, Arthur Murtagh was FBI agent in Atlanta for 11 years.
I was designated as the agent in Atlanta to handle Black Probe. The Black Probe was a program set up to develop informants in black organizations to keep the Bureau advised of the activities of blacks in connection with the civil rights movement. During that period, I spent a lot of my time developing black informants, and these were generally paid informants. During that same period, there was a vendetta against King that gained in momentum as the years went by, and I was in a room with my 7 other agents for the whole period while the wiretap was on.
Across the street from their office in downtown Atlanta, the FBI took a 7th-floor apartment for a 24-hour-a-day bugging operation on King's office, house, and hotel bedrooms. This was initiated by Hoover, who was at first convinced that King was under communist influence, then became obsessed with the wiretap revelations of King's sexual promiscuity. The FBI were guilty of bugging and harassing But were they guilty of something more sinister?
It was about between 6 and 7. I remember that it was beginning to get dark, and I was standing at the sign-out desk with another agent, and the news came over the radio that Dr. King had been shot and killed in Memphis. And this agent, at that moment, turned to me and hit his fist together like that and said something to the effect, "By God, we finally got him."
Did you say they finally got him or we finally got him?
No, he said we finally got him. That was what... It was the we that stuck in my mind. He didn't say they. He said we. I see the Constitution as a framework which is in the process of development, and it's our job as Americans to constantly embellish the Constitution and build it into a type of system, not necessarily just a document, that will result in equal rights, equal opportunity for all Americans. And I take this very, very seriously. I always have. And when I saw the Bureau and saw the way that it was working, saw what they were trying to do to King, I felt that we had within our own country a sort of fifth column trying to destroy the purposes of the Constitution.
It is not enough to simply say the FBI did it, or retired FBI agents or former FBI agents killed Dr. King. I mean, that has been a view that 10 years ago was certainly much in vogue, but it's much more complicated than that.
So when you run into data that says the FBI did this or the CIA did that, you have to be very careful, or you have to investigate a little further, because what it really is probably is the overlap of the two.
In early 1968, Myron Billett, a gopher for the Mafia, drove two senior mob figures, Sam Giancana and John Roselli, to a meeting with federal agents at a motel near the small town of Appalachian in upstate New York. At the meeting, the Mafia leaders were offered a contract to kill Martin Luther King.
There were Roselli, Sam, myself, and three guys from the FBI, and 3 or 4 guys came in from New York, the mob, and but they were the one that the FBI and the CIA were the one that came up with the hit. They wanted to come up with $1 million. They wanted to pay the mob $1 million to make a hit. And Sam said, no way we're going to get involved in nothing like that. And that was the end of it.
So who was it who made the suggestion, a CIA man or an FBI man?
CIA man.
Myron Billett is a dying man. We think it's unlikely that he would tell such a story now if it weren't true. And it's documented fact that Roselli and Giancana were contracted by the CIA to kill Castro. If they rejected the CIA's offer on King, there is evidence that a contract with local mob figures in Memphis may have been effected. In Memphis, we were aware of several frightened witnesses. Bill Pepper is taking us to see one of them.
I found a very fearful man with John. I found him very fearful then, and I find him now increasingly fearful. The first night I saw him, he insisted on our retiring to a room in the back of the garage, general store, and sitting with the lights out. I saw him again, and he always reminded me that he wasn't really unduly paranoid, but that in fact he had been shot at, and people had attempted to kill him, and he had been beaten up, and he at one point was hospitalized. There's a basis for his profound uneasiness.
Do you think he'll talk to us this afternoon?
I don't know whether he'll talk to us this afternoon. He vacillates. we have a very frightened man. He's just very, very afraid to come on camera and to say anything about this matter.
Tell us, Bill, what's his story?
On April 4th, 1968, at 5:15 in the afternoon, John McFerrin went to Liberto and Latch Produce Company to do his shopping. It was his last stop of the day before coming back to Somerville. Shortly after he entered the place, he heard a man he originally called the Fat Man, Frank Liberto, on the telephone. Heard Liberto say words to the effect, "Shoot the son of a bitch when he comes on the balcony. Don't come round here. Don't call me here. Go to New Orleans and pick up your money from my brother." The conversation ended at that point. McFerrin didn't think too much about that conversation until 6:30 p.m. He heard that Martin Luther King had been assassinated shortly after 6. Then it all made sense to him. He gave a statement to the FBI, and Memphis Police Department, and investigators, and eventually to the House Select Committee on Assassinations. They all disregarded his comments and ignored. I've known John for 10 years. I believe John had a crucial bit of information that was never looked at properly, never followed up, and disregarded. And the only reason it would have been disregarded was because it was inconvenient to the scenario that became, in effect, the official story.
But one example is Lloyd Jowers, who owned Jim's Grill. Jim's Grill was the place beyond which, through the back door of which, the Lorraine Motel could be seen, and there was a whole area of bushes. And Lloyd Jowers came to know that we had found 4 witnesses who were providing us independently with enough evidence against him so that he would be indicted if a grand jury ever heard the evidence. So he panicked, and he asked his lawyer to go get him immunity from prosecution, which the lawyer did. Didn't get it. He went to talk to the prosecutor, and he was very chuffed. He said, "Look, I represent Mr. Lloyd Jowers, and he was involved in a conspiracy to kill Martin Luther King, and he knows a lot of the details of that and who was involved, and a lot of the planning was done right in his own grill, and it was used as a staging area, the grill and the rooming house upstairs. And Lloyd will tell you all this, everything he knows, but you just got to give him immunity." Well, long story short, not only did Lloyd Jowers not get immunity, but he was never even interviewed by the district attorney or any of his staff. They just didn't want to know anything about changing the official story in this case. But Jowers was still panicking because I was determined to try to get him for that grand jury. So I asked a colleague of mine, a lawyer, Wayne Chastain, to sit outside the grand jury room and just seek to get in there. And every time the foreman of the grand jury came out, you went in, tell him you had this evidence about the killing of Martin Luther King, you had this evidence of this crime, that was a continuing crime, and you wanted to testify to the grand jury. Just badger and badger and badger, stay there. So Wayne sat there for a couple of weeks, and of course they ignored him totally. And the grand jury was under the control of the District Attorney General's office, and they didn't want to hear it. So Jowers knew we were trying to get into that grand jury. So he then offered to go on a program conducted by a reasonably independent guy named Sam Donaldson called Primetime Live. And he went on that television program, ABC, Primetime Live program, and he told the story of how he was approached by a man called Frank Liberto, who was a produce dealer in Memphis and who was a part of the Marcello organization. Memphis came within Carlos Marcello's domain, which stretched all the way out to Texas and even Southern California. So Liberto came, offered him $100,000, called in a big due bill and said, "Now you got to help us with this killing, this murder." And Jowers was given various tasks to do as a part of the team that was going to carry out the killing, and it was a mafia contract killing. So Lloyd knew we had gotten information that could indict him. He pushed it. He told the story in the Donaldson program. Said, "I'll give all the details of this, all the facts, all the evidence if I get immunity." He was still trying for that. Don't you know it? That television program and that event never became newsworthy. Nobody heard about that. Even ABC News the next morning didn't report it, and it was their own program the night before.
Usually when King would come to Memphis, well, even if he was at the church or something, we would, maybe I'd have maybe 20 men within that block. He had plenty of security. We knew he was coming. We'd have men at the airport to meet him, and we tried to give him more security that we could give him.
If security was always supplied to Dr. King, why was the 7-man police unit attached to him stripped away only 24 hours before the assassination? Under close questioning from the House Assassinations Committee, Memphis Police Director Frank Holloman denied that he had authorized the removal or had known about it at the time. On top of that, it's a matter of public record that 3 12-man police tactical units were pulled back 5 blocks from the vicinity of the Lorraine Motel on the morning of the assassination.
Now, on this occasion, the tactical units were withdrawn at some point on the day of the 4th of April, weren't they?
No, my cars was never withdrawn. About April 4th. No, we still had cars in the area.
Wasn't there some suggestion that they were pulled back at the request of one of Dr. King's party, that they were pulled back a number of blocks?
No, to my knowledge now, and the only way they'd been pulled back was on my command.
Philip Melanson, author of the recent book The Merkin Conspiracy, has made a special study of this issue.
I questioned Sam Evans about the withdrawal of the tactical units because this was a very important matter. Evans told me clearly and forcefully that the tactical units were withdrawn at the request of the Reverend Samuel Kiles, a man in King's entourage, and that he, Evans, had received the order, the request from Mr. Kiles, and had acceded to it. And he told me that flatly 2 years ago.
Could Melanson's book refresh Sam Evans' memory?
No, I didn't pull my men back.
Why is Sam Evans now being evasive on this important issue? Is it because the official excuse for removing the tacked cars just does not ring true?
For someone in the SCLC to have instructed, quote-unquote, the Memphis police to move back those tactical units would be laughable in that situation, and it's absurd to think that the Memphis Police Department would have acceded to that request. These tactical units were riot control forces that were there to keep the lid on the Lorraine and monitor King, and if he or anybody in his party had told them to move back, I think they would have increased the surveillance net or begun to look more sharply for trouble. It's unthinkable that they would simply be that accommodating.
In Memphis, there is evidence that the Secret Service did influence the activities of the police. Ed Reddit was a detective in a surveillance post at the fire station.
Oh, you can see the back, so you can see all of the courtyard of the Lorraine. In fact, the office, the whole bit from there, all the way down to the corner of the building. You can see everything around Lorraine. And Lieutenant Larkin arrived and stated that I was wanted at headquarters. I said, for what? He said, I don't know, just get in the car, let's go. I was told to bring you back. As I viewed the room, there appeared to be numerous law enforcement people from all of the various agencies, local, the county, state, and nationally. Director Frank Holloman stated that the man standing across from me was Secret Service from Washington, stating that there was a contract out on my life. At that time, he told Lieutenant Larkin to take me home and wait until someone arrived to guard me. Once we arrived at my house, while seated in the car, awaiting the security for me, being there, I imagine, no more than 5 or 10 minutes, the radio blasted out and Dr. King had been shot.
From various sources, we've been able to piece together that the information about the assassination attempt on Detective Reddit did indeed come direct to Chief Holloman from a Secret Service man in Washington. This departmental communication reveals that by 4:15 that afternoon, Lieutenant Arkin of the Memphis Police Department had been alerted by a phone call from the FBI that the assassination threat attributed to Reddit was a mistake. So why was Chief Holloman sending Reddit home at 5 p.m., 3/4 of an hour later? He testified to Congress that he was not told of the mistake at that time. Lieutenant Arkin, then head of the Police Intelligence Unit, can have no such excuse. He received the phone call and then personally took Reddit home. The reasons for his actions are unexplained. he refused to be interviewed for this program.
The Reddit affair represents the distraction of the Memphis Police Department by a false intelligence report from Washington that was inputted into the Memphis Police Department within hours before the assassination, and that seemed to have distracted everyone in the department to the extent that they were off on missions and having meetings, and that's very significant. The fact that Reddit had a different assignment is not the entire affair. Where that information came from about a false threat, why and how it was taken seriously, and what its distraction factor was, is the importance, and I think that has yet to be fathomed.
Floyd Newsom, a black fireman at the same station, was also inexplicably moved to another part of town that day. The company that I worked on consisted of 7 men, and the company could not work. It was out of service with less than 5 men. And on this particular day, I was the 5th man. So when they took me off of the company, that left the company with 4. They detailed me to a company that had a sufficient number of men. And the company that I should have been on was short. So they had to detail somebody there to replace me. I asked Deputy Chief Barnett why I was moved, and he said I was moved at the request of the police department.
My name is Jerry Williams. I'm a retired Memphis policeman. During the time of Dr. King's assassination, I was working the Homicide Bureau of Memphis Police Department. And on 2 previous occasions when Dr. King would come to Memphis, I was assigned to head his security team. But the last time he came, there were no black officers assigned for that security.
Why?
Well, I really don't know. I just know that I reported to work on the morning of Dr. King's assassination, and I was told by my inspector that we would not be on the assignment.
In the famous Lau photograph of the associates of Dr. King pointing away from the motel and toward the rooming house, there was for a long time a mystery about the person who was kneeling over Dr. King checking him for life signs. That person was Merrill McCullough, who somehow, when hearing the shot, instantly streaked up the stairs to the balcony and checked Dr. King. He was an undercover operative for the Memphis Police Department, but reporting directly to an intelligence officer of the Memphis Police Department.
Part of a web of covert action conducted by the security forces in Memphis, Merrill McCullough was just one of the shadowy figures involved. We learned from a police source that the owner of the Lorraine Motel was a police informer. So was Dr. King's chauffeur. The FBI had informers among black groups in Memphis and in the heart of King's party, the SCLC.
This man, Merrill McCullough, was a Vietnam veteran. He was described. He was a member of the Invaders. The Invader group was a group around Dr. King. They had been totally penetrated by police agents. It was Merrill McCullough, who was one of the last people to stand over Dr. King's body, who supposedly established the trajectory from the flophouse window to where Dr. King killed. And he said, I feel that I know this because I'm a Vietnam veteran. What he did not say is that he was also a police agent.
The first man to reach Dr. King was a man called Merrill McCullough. He was part of the 111th Military Intelligence Group. He was ostensibly a Memphis Police Department undercover agent. He had been called back to active duty in June of 1967, seconded to the Memphis Police Department, and then he infiltrated a neighborhood group called the Invaders. So he was in that with them, and when Martin King was shot, he was the first one to reach him and check him for life signs. So they were very heavily there.
A photographer on the scene documented the next few critical minutes.
The police were coming at that time with drawn guns, asking where the shot come from, and the people you see pointing saying it came from there.
Someone firing from the bushes would have had a similar view of his target as someone firing from the rooming house.
I started pointing to the rooming house. That's the only place that it looked like it could have come from.
Not that you heard the shot from there?
No, I didn't know where the shot came from. Now, it could have also come from the bushes.
But strangely, the next morning the bushes were all cut down.
Somebody gave an order in the middle of the night to go out and cut down that underbrush, so that when the sun came up on the 5th of April, the bushes were no longer there.
To Young, it smacks of cover-up. But the Memphis police say they cut the brush away to help, not hurt the investigation. Still, the motel area was not properly sealed off to protect evidence, and at least some key witnesses were never interviewed.
Then I see this figure directly at eye length coming out of a crouched position in this bushes. When you look directly across from my doorway, you were looking at thicket.
Dr. King's driver, Solomon Jones, later told Caldwell and another reporter he too saw someone in the bushes.
He said he saw this figure from the bushes, but he actually saw even the puff of smoke from the shot being fired from there. I quoted him in my story that was in the New York Times the next day.
The two reporters interviewed others who also said they saw something.
How many people saw somebody in the bushes?
At least a half a dozen.
And some of them say they saw a rifle?
Yes.
And do you believe that's where the shot came from?
Absolutely.
Solomon Jones, King's chauffeur, was standing under the balcony when King was shot.
I interviewed Solomon Jones in the lobby of the St. Joseph Hospital approximately about 7:05. This was a story he told all of us. As soon as the shot was fired, he looked out over the limousine. He saw a sniper with a white sheet on his face duck back down into the bushes. A few seconds later, he rose out of the bushes without the sheet, walked to the wall, jumped down from the wall. And you must understand that other people were coming out of the fire station at the same time, jumping from the wall. Solomon said this person he saw in the bushes joined in with the people jumping from the wall, jumped from the wall, walked on the premises, and he said he was scared.
Louis Ward was a taxi driver, and he had a taxi driver friend who came to the Lorraine shortly before the killing to pick somebody up. And guy was putting his suitcases into the car, and Dr. King was up on the balcony, and this taxi driver started to look over, called Buddy, started to look over there into the bushes. He just was looking around because he thought he heard something, saw something in the bushes. And the guy tapped him on the shoulder and said, oh, directed his attention to the balcony. Look, there's Martin King. Oh, we see him with somebody, and oh, look how exposed he is now. And he, you know, people say how difficult it would be to kill him, but look, there he is. And all of a sudden, the shot rang out. And he's looking, and Dr. King, who was hit, of course, right here, and he went down. And this driver instinctively turned back to those bushes. And he saw a man come down over the wall and run up Mulberry Street and get into a white Memphis Police Department traffic car that was parked in between Mulberry and Hewling like this. Get in and go away. So the guy gets on his radio and he said, King's been shot, but it looks, I don't know, maybe call an ambulance, but I think it's probably too late. But I think they got the guy anyway, because I just saw him get into a Memphis Police Department car. You know, so his buddy Louis Ward heard one part of this conversation with the dispatcher, and enough to know that this guy had seen something significant and who he was, and he was headed to the airport with this passenger who had to get out of there right away before all the ambulances came. So Louis went out, met him at the airport, and talked to him at the airport. He told him that story. He told him that story, and then 3 police officers came, and Louis stepped back, and he heard him tell the police officers the same story. And the way Louis was left, he was going to go down to see them, give them a statement the next morning. When Louis went back to the yellow cab place that night, he saw a lot of police cars around, and he figured the guy was being interviewed again, and that was all there was to it, and he went off. Now, because he was a part-time driver, he didn't come back to work for a few days. And when he came back in, he went into the driver's lounge, and he said, where's Buddy? I don't see Buddy. And there was this silence. And he said, where's Buddy? What's on the Buddy? And I said, finally one guy said to him, didn't you hear? I said, no. Well, he was killed the night of the King assassination. Killed? What happened to him? Well, somehow he he got himself thrown out of a moving car going across the Memphis, Arkansas bridge. And he's dead. And Louis was just shocked. And then, of course, Louis realized that maybe his friend had seen too much, and that was what happened. Well, Louis told this story also in the 93, 94, I think, when I first heard Louis. So people held these facts, held this information in for all of these years. Never told it, and because they were frightened. They were afraid, basically. So they held it back. And there's still people today holding things back.
And then I turn around and look back over my right shoulder, looking around to see, and I saw like a puff of smoke right behind the fire station where they had all of those bushes.
So in short, you think what you saw was the immediate moment just after the shot was fired?
Right, very much so.
And you're saying that you believe it was fired from the bushes behind the fire station?
Very much so.
Not the bathroom window?
That's correct. To this day, I haven't been talked to by the Justice Department, by the Memphis Police Department, no one about what I saw the day of the assassination. And I think some of the stuff was covered up, to be honest. I don't want to point fingers at people who was there, but why were some people talked to who wasn't within 50 yards of him, and I was like 5, 10 feet away from him and wasn't talked to?
But all of the police ran away from that shot instead of going to see who fired the shot.
There were 2 sniper teams at least there, and they were prepared to kill. That I have no doubt about whatsoever. One of the lessons we learned from one of the sources was that there was no way that this assassination would go forward unless it had approval all the way up the chain of command.
To where?
To the commander-in-chief.
You mean the president?
Yes.
But on the roof of the fire station, there were 2 Army photographers. They were psychological operations guys, and they were put up on the roof about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, I guess, well, 1 I guess it was, by Carthel Whedon, who was the captain of the fire station. Now, Carthel Whedon's a mystery man. He doesn't appear in any book anywhere. Name never surfaced. Nobody ever called him. Nobody ever talked to him. He didn't exist. And one day, I don't know quite what it was. I thought the man who used to always talk for the fire station was Ed Lonicky. He was a lieutenant. So I wondered, didn't the station have a captain? And I used to hang out in the station a lot. I played basketball there with some of the guys, and I thought they were going to start charging me rent at one time because it was such a critical place from an angle. So and then I said, yeah, of course it was the captain. It was Carthel Whedon. Carthel Whedon, where's he? Oh, he's retired a long time ago. Where's he? I don't know. Well, I found Carthel Whedon. I said, why don't you ever appear anywhere in any of the history of this case, or any of the investigative reports, the select committee, the FBI, Memphis, the police department? Anybody talking? No. I mean, why not, Carthel? You were captain. Weren't you on duty that day? Oh yeah, I was on duty. Well, now, is it true that there were some photographers on the roof of your station? He said, oh yeah. I put them up there. And they tell me the whole story about this thing. And of course, he testified trial later on. Hey, I put them up there. And what were they doing? He said, no, they still cameras, and they're just taking shots. Well, what we learned was that one focused on the balcony and one focused on the parking lot, and when King was shot, the one in the parking lot scanned off to the left and up into the bushes and actually caught had a photograph of the sniper bringing the rifle down after shooting. So the whole assassination of Martin Luther King was photographed, and those photographs are still around. We negotiated for a year and a half to try to get them, and my contact made a mistake, used his own name once going into a meeting in Miami, and the local FBI picked up the trail when he got off the plane and followed him to the meeting. And then as he was meeting with one of the photographers, he had met with both of them. He was meeting with one of them, negotiating a price, actually. This guy lived in Costa Rica, too. The one FBI agent just stuck this big long lens out the car
the passenger side of the car, and the guy saw it and just got totally spooked, and of course then read, and he said, you know, they really know everything we're doing.
The state's case is that at 6:01 p.m. on April the 4th, 1968, in Memphis, Tennessee, James Earl Ray shot Dr. King with one bullet from a high-powered rifle. King was standing on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel. The state said that Ray fired from the bathroom window of a rooming house 200 feet away. He then fled the scene, dropping a bundle, including the rifle with his prints on it, in a shop doorway. Then he drove off in his white Mustang down Main Street moments before the police arrived. James Earl Ray had been almost a year on the run from the Missouri State Penitentiary, where he'd been serving a 20-year sentence for robbing a supermarket. Ray claims that in July 1967, he met a mysterious character called Raoul in Montreal. Over the next 8 months, he carried out various assignments for Raoul, taking packages across the Canadian and Mexican borders for money. Raoul gave Ray $2,000 to buy a Mustang car. In late March 1968, Ray says that Raoul instructed him to purchase a rifle and bring it to Memphis as a sample for a gun-running deal. Ray says that at 3 p.m. on April the 4th, he rented a room in a flop house on Main Street, as previously agreed with Raoul. Later, Raoul asked Ray to leave while he met up with gun dealers.
So I went down and got the Mustang. I don't know what time it was that time. I guess it was 10 minutes till 6. My recollection may be wrong. I thought it was 3-4 blocks north and 3-4 blocks west, and stopped at the service station and asked him to fix a tire, if they could fix a tire. And this guy was, he said, no, we're too busy this time of day. So then I drove around. I was going to circle right back and park the car same place that I picked it up. When I got back up there, I seen, I think there was a squad car blocked off the street. Now, I don't know if he's right there at the intersection or he's about halfway down, but the street was blocked off, and I seen 2-3 people running around down there. So I said, well, I better not go down there. The police running around here. So I turned left, drove down through a predominantly black section. So after a while, I got on a main street. I was going to call this telephone number in New Orleans and find out if they could contact Raoul and see if anything happened there, because I thought maybe being some guns around there, some type of raid or something. Well, anyway, when I was driving out there, they said something about, I had radio and said something about Martin Luther King had been shot. I didn't think too much about that. And then about 10 minutes later, when I was on the outskirts of Memphis, or maybe I was actually in Mississippi, they said that they were looking for a white man in a white Mustang in connection with the shooting. So I decided then that I better, move on out of there. I drove on and cut off and went to Atlanta. And from Atlanta, I, went on to Canada, caught a bus.
For 20 years now, Ray has claimed that he was framed for the assassination of Dr. King by Raoul, who, he believes, was a professional gunman. If the assassin had fired the shot from the bathroom window, he would then have had to get out of the bath, put the rifle in its box, run to his room to pick up the bundle, then run 85 feet across the hallway, go down the stairs, drop the bundle in the shop entrance before walking to his car and driving away. All rather implausible. It would have required split-second timing before the first policeman arrived at the scene.
When you find a murder committed, and right outside the place you find a radio that he had in jail with his serial number on it, you find a beer can with his fingerprint on it, you find a gun with his fingerprint on it that was dropped right outside the building, conveniently for everybody to find it. But I think one of the most important things, two things. One, there was a tree in the way. And Earl Caldwell, he was a writer for the New York Times at the time. Right. The New York Times that day is the only paper, and I'm not a fan of the New York Times, I'm a fan of Earl Caldwell, that said that tree had been uprooted that night. Now, had that tree been there, it would have been possible for that shot to have come from that angle. And nobody seems to want to deal with this.
We were in the fire station when we heard the shot.
One of the first policemen to arrive at the balcony was Sheriff's Deputy Vernon Dollarhite.
Officer Maley and I proceeded north on Mulberry to Hewling Street. west on Hewlin and ran up towards Maine. And there's an alley behind the buildings where the shot was fired from. I directed Officer Maley to take up a position there. He was armed with a shotgun and a pistol and guard the alley. I proceeded on up to Main Street. I turned to go south on Main Street, checking those buildings. I proceeded on south, checking all the doors of all the establishments. There's one place called Jim's Bar and Grill. The door was open. I entered the building, and I told them there's been some trouble. Everybody stay inside. And I backed out of the building. At that time, I observed a rifle, a blue suitcase, and a green blanket laying on the sidewalk.
Did you see the package with the rifle when you went into Jim's Grill?
I did not. After I came outside and turned to my right, facing south, I immediately saw it. I feel sure that I would have observed it as I came down the sidewalk, because it was very noticeable, and I would have seen it.
How long were you in Jim's Grill?
Not more than 10 to 12, 15 seconds at the most.
3 different policemen have claimed to be the first to find the weapon. Astonishingly, even after 20 years, this question remains unresolved. But the fact is that Dolarhyde was certainly in Main Street within less than 2 minutes of the shooting.
I think it's very significant that a bundle of the alleged murder weapon appeared within 2 minutes on the street after the assassination. I think it's also significant that he didn't see it the first time that he came out, and it is very possible that someone was lying in wait in the entranceway to the rooming house, and then only came out and dropped it quickly after he went into Jim's Grill.
Do you think that person was the assassin, or was it somebody else?
I don't believe that person was the assassin. I believe that the person who dropped the bundle in all likelihood had a very specific role to play, and it was placing the bundle there. I don't believe the assassin was in the rooming house at all, and that this is just a part of disinformation.
2 months later, after leaving a trail of false identities, small-time crook James Earl Ray was arrested at Heathrow Airport in London. He was brought back to the States and sentenced to 99 years after pleading guilty to King's murder. With a trial that lasted only 2.5 hours, suspicions were raised. Was the verdict rushed through to cover up a conspiracy?
I don't give a continental damn whether there was a conspiracy.
Well, Mr. Foreman, did you ever ask your client whether he was a part of a conspiracy, whether he'd been hired?
No, I never asked him that, but I asked him enough other questions to convince me that he was not.
Did you ever feel that you could ever do more than save his life?
Never at any time, and so told him from the day I came in.
When Foreman came in the case, he was off for a trial, at least he pretended to be, and everything went okay up until sometime in February of 1969. We was going to trial up until then, and one time he came in with a paper, wanted me to sign it, saying that, we'd enter a guilty plea. He gave me a list of reasons why we should enter a plea. He also said the newspaper done convicted me by pretrial publicity, and so I told him I didn't think that was the grounds for entering a guilty plea, because I thought we could overcome some of this adverse publicity during the trial. His next gamut was that if I didn't enter a guilty plea, they might put my brother Jerry Ray in prison as a co-conspirator. And he also indicated that if I forced him at trial, he wouldn't put forth his best efforts.
Are you actually stating that you never recommended to Mr. Ray that he plead guilty in the case?
I have so stated. I state again. I never have recommended to any client. I did tell him the facts as I saw them. I told him I thought he would be convicted. I told him I thought he would be executed. And I had to tell him that because that was the truth.
Foreman's assertion that he didn't coerce Ray into a guilty plea is belied by the letter he wrote to him on the eve of the trial. Foreman's fee was coming from a book contract. Ray asked for $500 so that his brother could hire a new lawyer. Foreman agreed, quote, contingent on the plea of guilty going through without any unseemly conduct on your part in court.
So Mr. Foreman came to see me, and we discussed it, and I told him that I would, as in every case, where appropriate, accept a guilty plea on the basis of a 99-year sentence. I talked to the governor of Tennessee, the United States Attorney General, the Department of Justice. I did this as a matter of courtesy. They did not ever interfere with the way I conducted the prosecution of the case.
It's only recently become apparent that there was a conflict of interest in the court's appointment of Hugh Stanton Sr. to assist Ray's lawyer, Percy Foreman, in Ray's defense. Stanton had also acted as lawyer for the state's chief witness against Ray, Charles Stevens.
Did you ever consider that Hugh Stanton was in a conflict of interest because he had also represented Charlie Stevens? Was that ever considered?
No, as a matter of fact, I believe you're right that Mr. Stanton did. Well, I believe Mr. Stevens finally got somebody else. I don't know, but no, we didn't consider it any. You're telling me something that if that's a fact, I had forgotten it. But whatever it was, nothing came up to bother us about it.
The only person the state named who identified Ray as the man who left the rooming house after the shot was Charles Quitman Stevens.
Good customer. Bought a lot of beer in my place. Got drunk every day you could afford it.
And on the day of the shooting of Martin Luther King, he came downstairs in the afternoon.
Come down, I just got to work at 4 o'clock. Come down about 4:10 after I'd arrived at work. He was too drunk for me to sell him beer, then arrest him, so I sold him 2 quarts of beer to go.
We tracked down cab driver James McGraw, who got a call to pick up Stevens from the rooming house that day.
When I go up there and he was so drunk he couldn't even get out of bed. And I turned around and left and hauled him. I went back down and told the dispatcher. And I just made a U-turn and left. And before I got down to the train station, it come over the radio that Martin Luther King had got shot.
Mr. Stevens, what do you think of that picture? Does that look like the man?
Well, excuse me, from the glimpse that I got of his profile, it doesn't.
It doesn't?
No, sir. It certainly doesn't. For one thing, he's too heavy. His face is too full. He has too much hair. And his nose is too wide.
So, Stevens was drunk that afternoon and failed to identify a picture of Ray. Yet he was regarded as such an important witness that he was kept in protective custody for weeks before the trial. After Ray's conviction, Stevens claimed the $185,000 in reward money. His claim was rejected.
There's a white woman named Grace Stevens that the man that ran past her, she looked at in the face. Now, we got to go to England because England had tough laws. And when James Earl Ray was arrested in England by Scotland Yard, he was arrested not for the assassination of Dr. King, but for jailbreak. Now, the United States government have to present a case to England to get him expedited back here, and they had to find a witness. They went to Grace Stevens and showed her the picture. She said, that's not the man. They told her about the reward money. She said, that's not. They put this woman in a mental hospital. She stayed in a mental hospital for 11 years, and once they put her in the mental hospital, they got her husband to say that was him. That's the only way they got him over here.
There was a $50,000 reward for identification of anyone who would lead to the conviction for the murder, and Charlie Stevens was aware of that, and he was obviously angling for it, and. Yes, he was their lead witness, but they didn't even call him at the guilty plea hearing. They never even put him on the stand at the guilty plea hearing, and yet he was the main reason that James Earl Ray was extradited from England. It was on the basis of his affidavit. It was outrageous.
The strongest evidence of an FBI and CIA involvement with the assassination begins with a trail that starts here in Toronto with the aliases or alternative identities used by James Earl Ray. In 1967, 2 months after escaping from prison, Ray began using different identities at every opportunity. 4 names recur. All 4 are real, perfectly innocent people living within a 1.5-mile radius of each other in a Toronto suburb. All 4 had similar physical characteristics to Ray. One name, Eric Galt, was used by Ray over an entire 9-month period prior to the assassination. When King was killed, the name of the man police thought they were hunting was Eric Galt. A sharpshooter with relatives in Rhodesia, Galt could indeed have been a very plausible assassin. His similarities to Ray are remarkable. Ray has a scar on his forehead, so has Galt.
The scar on my forehead runs from one eye across to the other one. It's right over the bridge of the nose. The other scar that I think Ray has would be on the plastic surgery, which was on the tip of my nose.
1 month before the assassination, using Galt's name, Ray had plastic surgery on his nose. In addition, Ray and Galt both have scars on their right hands.
Coincidences that really fascinated me was the fact that when I was in Ottawa at an Ontario Council meeting, Ray, who had been there, was in 2 blocks of where I was. While I was in Montreal on another occasion, Ray was also in an area, was in a couple of blocks of where I had stayed. Identification that he would pick up on me would be absolutely remote. I don't think there's any way that he could have gotten my name without some assistance.
How did Ray get access to these identities? It's recently come to light that Eric Galt's details were in a top security file because of his work on a then secret defense contract for the Union Carbide Company in Toronto.
There are files in every company that we have defense contracts with. Very, very elaborate file, because they want to know who they're dealing with. I myself have had access to Canadian and Australian and British material that those countries considered secret, top secret and all, and in exchange we provided our material. So if you were going to fabricate a record for somebody or use somebody else's record as a cover, that could be done even though it involved 2 countries or 3 countries.
The aliases question is crucial because it was unexplained by official investigations, and it's obviously central to this case. James Earl Ray was able to use the names of people who looked like him, who were totally innocent, and in the case of Mr. Galt, who shared uncanny characteristics with Ray, when Ray had no capacity to have gone to Toronto and scouted these names out or gotten them from a file. And to me, that means they were provided to Ray, which means a conspiracy.
Yes, there have been some threats in my life. Occasional references, more than occasional, to the fact that do you know who you're dealing with, and do you know the power of these people, and do you know what they can do? You know, as we sit here, at any point in time, if these forces want to kill one, they can do it. There's just no way, and Martin knew that as well. There's no way that you can stop them from killing you.
Donald Wilson is a very brave man. He was a young FBI agent, and he stumbled on, just to give the group the story, he stumbled on, he was asked to go out and check out this Mustang, which was James's car, that it was found in a parking lot at a housing development in Atlanta. And he opened the door on the passenger, he went out there with another agent, and he opened the door on the passenger side, which he said was slightly ajar, I think, and out of a pocket in the car door fell an envelope, and he panicked. He said, "Ooh, I think maybe I'm messing up evidence," or he just panicked. He put his foot on it, and then when no one was looking, he reached down, he picked it up, and he put it in his pocket, and he just took it away with him. He turned it over. And when he read it, he realized what he had found. And it was, he didn't realize fully what he had found. He didn't realize fully what he found till we checked out the phone number that was on there. We finally checked out the phone number. He found, so there were several pieces of paper, but what most significantly was one with Raoul's name on it. Then there was a telephone number with a J and a telephone number. That telephone number turned out to be a phone number of a club that was run by Jack Ruby in Dallas. And so what he had done in one fell swoop effectively was find a piece of paper that linked apparently critical people in the King assassination with Jack Ruby. Now, I had heard that I always stayed away from the links with the Kennedy assassination. But when I became aware of that, I went into Dallas and I interviewed separately some of Ruby's people, as Ruby's bar girls and waitresses. And I showed them separately this photograph of Raoul and asked them not to call any of the others that I was going to see. They didn't. And each one of them identified this man, Raoul, as having been with Jack Ruby, seen with him many times in the Carousel and other clubs. And of course, Glenda Graybo always had said she saw Ruby and Raoul together in Houston. and something even more sinister than that in terms of her relationship with Ruby. But she was spot on. Yeah. So what happened with that, in answer to your question, because that was put on the evidence at the trial, the Attorney General's office subjected that former FBI agent to sheer hell, harassed him, threatened him with prosecution, surveilled him, in order to get the originals of those documents that he found, which they now have. And then they dismissed them, of course, as having any reality.
You see, when there's an assassination, you have to have a lone nut, because a lone nut can kill somebody for no reason. If you admit that 3 or 4 people were involved, or that there was, to use an overworked term, conspiracy, then you have to say, well, the conspiracy had a reason. Well, they don't ever want to face that reason. What was the reason why Kennedy was killed? What was the reason why King was killed? By having a lone nut, you don't have to ask that question.
I believe that there was a very complex plot that involved organized crime. It involved the military, and which one of them actually pulled the trigger, I don't know. But I think that there were influences in very high places in our government that were responsible for putting all of this plot together.
Including the FBI?
Oh, especially the FBI.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
The truth is not what you see, but what remains hidden. Open your eyes.